let's go all the way back. The beginning of Israel, right? Canaanite city-states. This land never belonged to Palestine.
Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm super excited to have you guys here today with somebody that's going to help me break down everything that's happening around the world right now, specifically in the Middle East with Israel and Palestine and everything that's a big old mess. So I wanted to bring this person on here because we had a little bit of technical difficulties yesterday, but he had such a clear and concise answer for me that I wanted to bring him on and really just unpack this right from the get-go. So one half of the Empire State Conservatives, Evan, thank you so much for being here with me, man.
No problem, Angel. Thanks for having me.
Cool. So I want to jump right into the thick of it with you when it comes to everything happening in the Middle East. There have been some conversations that I've been hearing online that are very surprising coming from the right side, about how maybe Israel isn't necessarily a priority. We don't necessarily have to be intervening there. And there's all of these like kind of, I want to call them cop-outs of, you know, our defense of Israel, you know, almost excuses for why we shouldn't be defending Israel. Have you heard any of these, and what are your thoughts on this kind of stuff?
Usually the argument that I hear is that, oh, we shouldn't be giving foreign aid to Israel, we shouldn't be doing all of this. And in reality, the issue that Israel's having, it's not a lack of foreign aid or a lack of money. The issue is that, as we all know, the Hamas has been firing missiles into Tel Aviv and to Jerusalem over from Gaza. And what Israel has is called the Iron Dome, and it's a missile defense system that launches missiles to intercept these rockets. Now, this system is based off of the Ronald Reagan era Star Wars system, which was mocked by Democrats, but now is used extremely successfully by Israel. And what happens is these rockets are extremely expensive, and they use a ton of them every time that rockets are fired into Israel. So what was actually going to be done was we were going to sell rockets to Israel, which again is not foreign aid. That's a transaction between us and an ally. So if you're all for not giving foreign aid, which again I'm all for giving nobody foreign aid. We have enough issues here that, you know, we need the money for our own people. But to sell something where we are now getting money in return that we can use for our own citizens, there should be no issue with that, with selling weapons to an ally so they can defend their own citizens.
I think that you're hitting something that I don't think a lot of people are talking about, which is the need for American intervention in certain places in the world, right? Like this idea that, like, if left in a vacuum, America would kind of just be left neutral and we'd be left alone, and also nobody else would come into the Middle East and try and meddle in it in any way. Is kind of misguided, right? Like there's always going to be another world power that's going to try and go into wherever is hot at the moment and try and kind of have their way, right? An example would be China or Russia or something. Another like superpower would come in and try and change the way things are run there for their own benefit, because that's kind of the nature of the way the world works and the way geopolitics works. So what do you think? I want to zoom in, right, as far as like Palestine and Israel and all these things. What is the argument for Palestine, like, as you understand it? Why are people so willing to say that it's a what do they call it, a genocide, it's an apartheid state, all these crazy allegations that this is the first time I'm hearing about in relation to that argument?
Yeah, well, first let's start with the accusation that Israel's an apartheid state. Number one, there are almost 2 million Arabs living in Israel, all of which have full civil liberties. They are full citizens. They have every right afforded to every Jewish Israeli citizen. Okay? So number one, that's not what apartheid is. As we all know, apartheid was a system where they separated races in South Africa, and blacks were kept as a lower class, and all the whites were in charge. Okay? So it's clearly not an apartheid system. Number two, Israel is not in charge of Gaza or the West Bank. They fully pulled out of there over almost a decade ago. Or over a decade ago. They've been gone for a long time. Those areas are fully under the control of Hamas and Fatah. So Israel is not in control of Gaza. So the conditions in Gaza have nothing to do with the Israeli government, because the Israeli government is not responsible for it. The people 100% responsible for it are the terrorist group Hamas. They are fully in charge of Gaza. They run everything there. So that's another huge lie that Palestine is somehow run by Israel, which is not true. It's something that's just completely made up. And you see people actually even starting to backtrack now. And it's good that you have me back on, because even left-wing lunatic Mark Ruffalo had to come out and say that he had to stop talking about, going against Israel, because it was perpetrating lies and perpetrating anti-Semitism, which was completely unnecessary. And it was spreading lies.
Wow.
It's not an apartheid state, and they're not even in charge of Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing people like Linda Sarsour and Ilhan Omar now kind of doubling down, which I find incredible, kind of just using the same lies of, Palestine are the oppressed and Israel is this white oppressor, and then just using that as a way to kind of extend anti-Semitism. And it's baffling to me on multiple levels, right? Because now we're starting to see how it leaks into American politics and why we care so much about it here. And it's particularly in New York, it's hitting so deeply, right? This idea of oppressed versus oppressor. It's the age-old tale of what we've been doing as far as politics go here in America forever. So can you unpack a little bit of why we care so much about it here and right now?
Well, the reason why the left cares about it so much is because they can use these people as victims, and they can use them and exploit them for their own gain. And you see groups like BLM supporting Palestine. And I actually got fact-checked by Facebook when I said that BLM was supporting Hamas, and they said, no, they came out in support of Palestine. Geniuses. Hamas is in charge of the Palestinian area. It's one and the same. The Palestinian people are 100% exploited by Hamas. All the foreign aid that goes over to Gaza is taken by Hamas, and then Hamas distributes it in a pay-for-slay campaign to get these people to attack Israel and try to kill Israeli citizens.
So to play devil's advocate then, when you're talking about the Palestinian people, not Hamas, not the Palestinian government, but the people themselves, what can they do to try and mitigate all this or to try and get their way? I know that I want to ask you later about what an example of Palestinian justice would look like, because I think that's an important question. But right now, as an individual, somebody who is either here and they're Palestinians and they came here from Palestine, or they're actually in Palestine, what are their options at this point?
So, honestly, they don't have a lot of options, because the Arab world has already seen that for decades and decades, everyone who takes over in terms of the Palestinian people, it's always a terror group. From Yasser Arafat and the PLO to Hamas to Fatah, they're always terror groups, and their only mission is the death of every Jew in Israel. That's what it's always been. That's what it always will be. So their best bet is actually to appeal to Israel and to ask Israel to retake this land and destroy Hamas and Fatah, and then allow these people Israeli citizenship and stop pushing for the death of Jews and for the destruction of Israel. That's honestly their best bet, but it's something that they're not going to do, because Hamas and Fatah, when they run these areas, they indoctrinate these children, and they teach children that, you want to take a knife and slit a Jew's throat. This is stuff that's going on. This is video. This is documented on video. We've seen these videos. This isn't some lie that's made up, and it's really disgusting that people like Ilhan Omar and Linda Sarsour, who are just both giant anti-Semites and really not high IQ people. Again, I don't like to insult people, but there's a time when you need to just back down. There is no genocide. There is no apartheid state, but you're going to keep pushing this? There's such little genocide in terms of the Palestinians when it comes to the IDF, that the IDF will drop pamphlets telling Palestinians when attacks are coming from the IDF. They will call them on the phone and tell them to evacuate buildings, because they only want to hit military targets. But the problem is you have Hamas hiding in hospitals, right? They manufacture all their weapons underneath hospitals, underneath schools, in tunnels. They're hiding amongst civilian population because they know it makes the IDF look bad. All they have to do is go, no, they killed civilians. See, look, they hit this hospital. Well, that hospital was producing rockets, which were being fired at Israeli citizens in civilian areas. Hamas and Fatah, they never go after the Israeli military. They only go after soft targets such as Israeli citizens.
Right. Yeah. It seems to be an apples to oranges kind of thing, where Hamas is blatantly going after civilians, and then Israel, the IDF, is going out of their way to avoid citizens, and it's still being painted in this crazy light here in America with the way our media is set up. I'm curious to know, as a general consensus, because this is the most that I've heard about support for Palestine in this I guess iteration of the story of the Middle East, right? It's been more and more, and particularly on the right side as well. So I'm interested to know, what is what does Palestinian justice look like? What do they imagine it looking like? I know it can range, but generally speaking.
Well, in terms, if you talk about, justice, if we're going to use the left's term of justice, as we all know, justice actually means in accordance with the law. So in accordance with the law, they already have their justice. They have land. Build up your land. Get rid of Hamas and Fatah and build up your land. But the problem that you have now is you have this massive tent of the oppressed, right? So anyone who has an advantage is automatically an oppressor, and anyone who's at a slight disadvantage is automatically oppressed. That's why you have such a huge following for Palestine now, especially on the American left, with groups like BLM and all these other places, Queers for Palestine, which I don't understand at all because they murder people over there. It really doesn't make any sense. But honestly, like I said before, the Palestinian justice would be the IDF going in, destroying these terror organizations, and these people, saying, "Hey, we will live in Israel under Israel's jurisdiction, in peace." That's what it comes down to. There is no other way. The only other option they have, in which they can't do because they have no weapons, is to revolt and take down Hamas and Fatah themselves. But they don't have the ability to do that.
Wow. Yeah, it's definitely like one of those. It's a Western standoff. Is that what it's called? Where everybody's got the guns pointed at each other, in different directions. That's what it really feels like. It's like who's going to be the first to surrender? Who's going to be the first to pull the trigger? Obviously, Hamas has been the aggressor. Oh, well, okay. So this is an interesting thing that I heard recently from somebody that I think we both agree we don't necessarily like much. But he was talking about Palestine, and he was breaking down the whole history of the the Gaza Strip conflict, right? Israel versus Palestine. And he was saying that in most cases, Israel was the aggressor. And I don't know. I've never heard that really. I've always heard it from a microscopic lens, from like what's the word? Just like an anecdotal perspective. It seems like to some people in Palestine that Israel would be the aggressor because the IDF is coming over and maybe they're like taking people and like arresting them and something like that. But do you see any way that Israel would be considered the aggressor in these situations?
So, again, from the people on the ground who are brainwashed and people on the American left who are brainwashed, it might seem that way because of their, the scales aren't balanced, right? We heard it from Trevor Noah. How can Israel go against these people who don't have the type of weaponry, right? It's all foolish. From the day that Israel was created, they've been attacked on all sides by every Arab nation. The day they declared their independence, they were attacked by all the surrounding nations. They fought the 7-Day War. They actually conquered about, I think it was half of Egypt. And they conquered basically the whole Sinai Peninsula, and they gave it back to Egypt in the name of peace. Israel has constantly made concessions to these groups. They gave up the West Bank. They gave up Gaza as a concession. They've given up control, essentially, of the Temple Mount. Jews are not allowed at the holiest site in Judaism because the Muslims wanted it. It's not even the holiest site in Islam, but the Muslims wanted it. So the Israeli government, in the name of peace, gave them control of the Temple Mount, which they now use to stage riots and rallies and terror activities. It's a joke. Israel, first of all, Israel shouldn't even be doing all of this. Can you imagine this? First of all, you don't have to imagine. This is what happened in Seattle. They had chop or chaz, whatever it was, and the police just left. And how did that go?
Right.
It never works out. It's the exact same thing Israel did. And if you constantly give concessions to terrorists in order to, for peace, you'll never win. Because the only thing they want, and they said this a million times, is they want the death of every Jew in Israel. So there's a very famous saying, when someone tells you they want to kill you, believe them. They want you dead. Stop playing nice with these people.
Right. That's a great response. I wanted to kind of zoom out a little bit, go back to what we were talking about in the beginning, which is kind of geopolitics. Do you think that supporting Israel and supporting the Iron Dome and all of these things that are essentially initiatives specifically for Israel alliances, do you think that contradicts an America First worldview or America First political view?
I don't think it does at all, because if you look at how America's going to, we're able to keep America first, right? Again, I'm all for not giving free money to anybody. If Israel is going to pay us to protect their citizens, then we're not giving anything up. We're bringing in money that we can then use. Well, it goes to the government, so it's not really going to be used this way, but it could be used to help the American citizens. Number two, Israel is the only kind of westernized country in the Middle East. So if we don't want these places to be taken over by radicalism, if we don't want these places to be taken over by socialist communist dictators like they've tried to do during the Cold War, right? Russia went into Afghanistan. They tried to take over everything. This is what they do.
Right.
The goal of communism is to spread throughout the world. So if we want to keep Western civilization going, then we have to help Western nations. And again, it doesn't mean giving them something for nothing. Selling them missiles so they can defend their own citizens is something that benefits us and it benefits our allies.
Wow. Yeah, no, that definitely puts things into context. You know, for me in particular, as a Christian, it's easy for me to kind of be biased towards Israel, right? And kind of say like, well, I'm in support of Israel. You know, I read about it in the scriptures. I read about the people. I read about the covenants that God has with the Jewish people, and to me, I'm naturally inclined to do so. But then what ends up happening is that there's and I'm not using this word in a dirty way, the way most people use it, but Zionism, right? There's the Zionist idea of like there is a divine claim to the land that is given by God, and that as a Christian is not something that I necessarily believe, but I like to look at it I like to look at these things as like a geopolitical issues that I'm kind of separate from and just kind of zoom out from them, because you know otherwise I'm biased, like I said. So that kind of pushes me more towards saying, okay, well, what is the history of the conflict and where does the conflict start? And for the life of me, I can't figure out where it starts, what the first step was, how, like, all of that is such a deep dive into history, right? And I just want somebody to just lay it out crystal clear. Is there a way that you can do that for me and kind of settle my mind right now?
Yeah, I'm going to simplify it real easy for you, all right? So the best way to think about Zionism is that Israel is the ancestral home of the Jews. Okay, and Israel has a right to exist as a free state and as a free Jewish state. And again, every Arab, 1.9 million, who live inside Israel have full civil liberties, just like you and I do in America, right? Just because that we are different races doesn't mean that you have less civil liberties than me. Every Arab in Israel has full rights as a citizen, okay? Let's go all the way back. The beginning of Israel, right? Canaanite city-states. Then we move forward. We have the 12 tribes of Israel. Then we can move forwards again. Yes. We have Judea, right? Then we have Judea and Samaria. Then we keep going forwards. We have the Greeks take over. The Babylonians take over. The Romans take over. All these groups, right? The Ottoman Empire, the Kurds, all these groups. The British Mandate. This land never belonged to Palestinians. When it was called Palestine, it was not run by the Palestinians. It was part of other empires. Even Egypt owned it at one point. This land has never belonged to Palestinians. But what happened is when they made the state of Israel, right, they split the British Mandate. And they actually made land for the Palestinians. It's called Jordan. That's where they wanted to go. But they could not suffer the fact that Jews now had their ancestral homeland back, and Jews had control over Jerusalem, and Jews had control over Israel, their ancestral homeland, and they wanted the death of, again, it comes down to anti-Zionism, right? They can lie to you all they want. They'll say it's just against the Israeli government. But every anti-Zionist supports terror groups that want the death of every Jew in Israel. That's like saying, I'm not for white nationalism, but, you know, I'm going to support the Ku Klux Klan. That doesn't make any sense.
Right.
So you can't say that you're not an anti-Semite and then support groups that only want the death and destruction of the Jewish state.
Wow. Okay. So that makes a lot more sense. I think that kind of breakdown of the linear history is something that needs to be talked about more, because, you know, I've heard Palestinians argue till they're blue in the face about how the land was originally, you know, it was you know, belonged to the Philistines, and, you know, there's all these like weird mixtures of history. But one thing, and I'm going to dive into religion in a little bit, but one thing that I've noticed is that innate to the Quran is kind of a reinterpreting of history. You know, the way Muhammad speaks in the Quran constantly rearranges the way things happened in history to benefit Islam and to benefit the worldview of Islam. And innate within the worldview of Islam is a government. It's a governmental structure, and it's a need to conquer new territory. So I can't help but think, as somebody that's looked into, you know, Islam briefly and kind of seriously, that is where this is all coming from. I mean, starting from the roots of Islam, where, you know, it's you know, the sons of Abraham, where they split off into two, and the one was banished essentially. That's the descendant. That's where Islam descends from, right? That lineage. And so for me, it's like, okay, obviously there's almost a a conquering out of bitterness that comes along with the Islamic worldview. And not to say that every person who's Muslim thinks that way or anything like that, but it's just innate to the theology of it. And that's the problem that I'm having. Whereas Judaism is kind of the exact opposite, where it's like we're sticking to biblical principles. So I guess I'm just trying to explain that and just put that out there. If there's anything that you want to add to that, please.
No, 100%. And so I actually spoke to a rabbi about this. So we would talk about Judaism and the differences between Judaism and Christianity and the development of Christianity throughout Europe. And it kind of, it's a little bit different from it. It's very different from Islam. So modern Christianity, what they did in order to get people under that umbrella of Christianity was they helped bring in the pagan festivals, right? You have the Christmas tree. A lot of these symbols are pagan symbols, but they brought it into Christianity to tell people, hey, you have a home here. You believe in Christ, you can keep these traditions. We're going to, but we want you to believe in God. We want you to believe in Jesus. 100%. Right. Got it. It makes perfect sense. Judaism is kind of like, you guys do you. You don't want to be us. That's fine. We're good. We're good over here. That's really what Judaism is in terms of like how we operate. Because, you had Christian missionaries going out and converting people, trying to save people. 100%. Good. Good for them. Judaism didn't do that. Judaism has never.
Judaism doesn't have embedded in it the need to evangelize.
Yes. So Islam
it's about a lineage.
Is a little bit different.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes. Islam, throughout history, is kind of convert or die. It's either you are one of us or we're going to kill you. That throughout history, and again, this is, like you said, it is not every Muslim by any stretch of the imagination. I know a lot of Muslim people. I am friends with a good amount of Muslim people. They're not like that at all. Extremely nice people. But overall, radical Islam has been that throughout history, and it's still that to this day. And we've seen that go on with the beheading of journalists and the beheading of Christians. And even, I think it was a few years ago, that couple took a bike ride through, I think it was ISIS territory, and ISIS ran them over and beheaded them. They killed them just for riding their bikes. So it's a completely different theology. And when you have a group, which it is in the middle of all these Islamic countries, and they're Jewish, it's just one of those things that sticks in the thorn of these radical groups, and they don't want to have to allow it. They're not tolerant people, as we all know. They don't give rights to women. They don't give they murder gay people. This is not a secret. So the fact that the left, which is supposed to be this beacon of feminism and helping women and gays and all these other groups, and then you support groups that if you walked into their neighborhood, they would hang you or behead you. It just doesn't make any sense. It's this weird thing where they don't care what it is as long as you're against the perceived oppressor.
Right. Man, talk about bringing that home. I mean, I definitely want to have you back on with Gabe, and we can talk about local New York stuff. I wanted to isolate this. I want to put this clip up. I'm going to post it everywhere, man, because this has helped me understand things on a whole nother level. So, dude, I just want to say thank you for coming out again, because I know we had some technical difficulties, and I definitely want to have you guys back on.
Oh, definitely, Andrew. I'm always glad to explain this to people. Because once again, these anti-Semitic tropes of, Jews have dual loyalty. If the Israeli government was actually going in and murdering women and children, I would be the first person to go, hey, that's not cool. Someone needs to step in and needs to stop these people. That's not what's happening. It's just not reality. And the problem is we live in this world now where it's my truth, right? Whatever you believe to be going on is valid. And we can't do that because this is life and death for Israeli citizens. And again, not just Jews. Arabs live in Tel Aviv. Arabs live in Jerusalem. These people are Israeli citizens. So it's just something that really needs to be spoken about more from a factual standpoint as opposed to this perceived oppressor-oppressed dynamic.
I love it, man. I love it. I want to leave time for you to be able to plug everything that you're doing, plug, Empire State Conservatives, where people can follow you. And if they want to debate you, ask you questions, all that stuff, where can they find you?
All right, so 100%, guys, if you want to follow us, you can go to Facebook at our group is Empire State Conservatives. If you want to follow us on Instagram, it's _Empire State Conservatives. On Twitter at Empire State Cons. You can visit our website, empirestateconservatives.com. That is the best way to support us. Buy a shirt, buy a hat. All that money goes back into spreading conservatism in New York, which is our goal. We are looking to have a few of the gubernatorial candidates on the show in the upcoming months. So hopefully that stuff will come through. And to stay updated, always,
Nice.
Again, our Facebook page, Empire State Conservatives.
I love it, man. Thanks again. And if you are watching this, make sure you go subscribe to Empire State Conservatives. Make sure you subscribe here, like, comment, share. Tell us what you agree with, what you don't agree with, the whole 9 yards. Thank you guys for watching. See you on the next one.